You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about Late Night with the Devil. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau, and we're talking about 2024's Late Night with the Devil.
On Halloween night, 1977, America gathered around for a live TV event that shocked a nation. What happened was real. What you are about to see is the recently discovered master tape of what went to air that night.
With Mr.
Ladies and gentlemen, now, here's Mr. Midnight Jack Dowell.
Late Night with the Devil.
This supernatural horror film was written, directed, and edited by Cameron and Colin Carnes, and it's set up as a found footage film with this documentary prologue in the vein of Ghost Watch or the WNUF Halloween special, except in this case, instead of found footage like a VHS in Chris LaMartina's WNUF Halloween special or Ghost Watch, where it's set up as like a BBC broadcast where people are investigating a potential haunted home and exorcism, Late Night with the Devil is really about a talk show host named Jack Delroy, and how he is hosting a allegedly possessed girl on his program. And his program is a late night show in the vein of Dick Cavett or Johnny Carson. In this case, it takes place in the kind of like late 1970s. And it has everything that you would imagine a late night show to have: an opening monologue, a backup band, a sidekick, kind of like a co-host. It has all of these things to really make you believe that you're watching late 70s talk show episode that just happens to, have a curveball throw in because it involves a girl that's possessed.
Yeah, setting up the world of, hey, this happened in the 70s and we've come across the footage and we have to show you, but this definitely happened and this was something that was real. And as long as you buy into that conceit, then you've bought your ticket and now you're on the ride.
That's right. We saw this movie in the early part of a recent road trip that Pete and I took, and it was fun to watch because, one, it's in limited release, so it's kind of neat to support indie film. Two, it's going to be released on Shudder in streaming, so kind of neat to see a film that's going to get hopefully talked about even more. Once people can watch it from the comfort of their own home, just pop it in on Shudder on a Friday night and give it a watch. And the good thing about this film is that we really liked it. We liked the majority of it. We kind of take the position on the podcast that we don't shit talk a film. If it just is not made for us, that's okay. And, I think the majority of this film, it worked. It worked for the both of us. I don't know, however, that it necessarily stuck the landing.
Most of it, yeah. Again, for me, a lot of modern horror, they don't always stick the landing. I would argue that this movie sticks the landing and just not the landing that I would have preferred. I saw this kind of playing out a slightly different way, but up until that point, I was in. I was in on the conceit. I loved it. I grew up certainly very familiar with this style of, late night talk show. All of it felt very familiar to me growing up as a child of the 70s. So, and that in itself doesn't guarantee that it's going to be great, but when you couple that with the performances led by David Dastmalchian, he really, it's in, for all intents and purposes, his movie. And with a lesser actor, I would probably argue that this movie would be an afterthought. But no, he delivers his performance as the self-styled host of, was it Night Owls is the name of it? That's right, yes. And Jack Delray, I believe is his character's name.
Yeah, just a perfect name for what would be contemporaries to this fictional character. People like Jack Parr or Merv Griffin, certainly Dick Cavett, Johnny Carson, like I mentioned before. They just feel like these are all the people that would have been airing around the 60s into the 70s that would have been contemporaries with Jack.
Totally. Yes. So he everything kind of revolves around him, and he delivers. So that's what makes, I would say, 90% of this movie really, really great.
What this movie does well, it really does great. The design, everything from the backgrounds, the backdrops on the talk show set, the costuming, the overall vibe just feels 1970s. And then on top of that, the fact that this broadcast that presumably takes place on Halloween in the 1970s is also leaning into the whole satanic panic and the occult, but also this other trope of having a debunker on as a panelist to almost balance out the perspective. You get all of that, and then you also get Jack Delroy as just being kind of like a very charming host that has all of the, the monologue that also addresses celebrities and politics, everything of that era, with the band kind of doing the ba-dum-ching on the drum. You've got the studio audience charping in. And then you also have this acknowledgement that this broadcast is happening at a time when Delroy is a little bit of an also-ran. The ratings are not great. It's sweeps weeks. So you kind of get this anxiety that he's being a little bit vulnerable with the audience to let them know that he's not at the top of the ratings. And because of that, his show may get the axe. So there's a lot of that kind of happening, but all of it that just kind of keeps cementing the reality, the authenticity of it all.
Again, like the way that this movie ramps it up, as things start off kind of innocuous, it's literally a Halloween night, late night talk show that is going for, big ratings, and its host is competing for that top spot among the late night hosts, and will do and say just about anything to make sure that he's got that audience to finally take him to, the top of the heap as among the late night hosts. So as things start to unravel, you really just see it in his eyes and his calculations of, should we stop this maybe, or we should probably keep going. But there's also concern, there's fear, there's some hesitation, but and it's not just him, but it's mostly driven by him and his producer that kind of keep the night and the events going, because, despite things getting a little bit crazy is, as they're seeing from all the people calling into the show and from the feedback they're getting, it's meaning big numbers. And so how do you turn that down when that's exactly the thing that you want? So everything kind of spirals out from there.
And that spiraling really starts because of this celebration of Halloween night, because of the guests, all the guests that show up, all of them involved in the supernatural in one way or another. Starting off with the psychic Christou, played by Faisal Bazzi, who starts by reading some audience members' minds, and we'll have to definitely talk about that. And then he's joined by Carmichael the Conjurer, played by Ian Bliss, who's like this ex-magician who's now a debunker. He's a skeptic. And then the third guest, and this is where, again, things really go haywire, is this parapsychologist, author Dr. June Ross Mitchell, who's played by Laura Gordon. And she's got this new book that's titled Conversations with the Devil. And the subject of the book is Lily, who's played by Ingrid Torelli. And Ingrid is essentially the survivor, the lone survivor of this satanic church. Think like the Waco cult, where there was a big fire where a lot of the cult members were killed. So Lily is the lone survivor of a tragedy like that. And she's now been essentially adopted, taken in by Dr. June. And in that therapy, Dr. June has discovered that this poor girl is essentially a vessel for a satanic entity of some sort.
That's the lineup that Jack's got for the night. But you mentioned earlier, Bernie, that this really leans heavily into those like 70s like Dick Cavett style shows, because this movie takes place in New York City. Commercial bumpers have like the Twin Towers on them. They mentioned going to Cedars-Sinai at one point to the hospital. So that obviously rang even more true. Personally, growing up, I didn't watch this guy too much. but one of the local late night guys, he was in between like just cable access and where you would get more into the Carson. We had a guy called Joe Franklin on WOR Channel 9.
This is WOR-TV, Channel 9, New York.
The Beastie Boys, one of their first ever appearances was on his show. He was like this kind of old New York guy, and he'd have occasionally someone that you might have heard of, but they were usually like some local talent. And then there was always like a weird crackpot guest on there.
Yep.
And he was just, he kind of kept the show running, and he was basically an institution on New York and the tri-state area TV for decades.
And I think that's where a lot of these late night show hosts of the era, especially not the top tier talent, would not get top tier celebrities or politicians or musicians. They would get, the D-list actors, musicians that were maybe a little longer in the tooth, promoting a new album or tour. But then they would also get, like you mentioned, like some of the crackpots, people that were a bit goofy. Maybe they believed in aliens, just shared a story about being abducted. Maybe you had someone who had kind of like a goofy trick where they could juggle knives. I mean, the whole point was that at this late night hour with this type of host on this type of show, kind of anything would go. And they had the latitude, the producer, the creatives behind this, to essentially do whatever they could to keep their audience. And that's where, especially with the guests that come on Jack's show for Late Night with the Devil, that's where it shines, because it gets that progression where you feel that kind of desperation. Now, did you notice with that first guest, Chris Du, that it actually, I think, purposely was meant to sound like the amazing Criswell? And I always remember that from the Tim Burton movie Ed Wood. I think the actor, it was Jeffrey Jones that played Criswell, but I think that was all very much on purpose.
Greetings, my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives.
Yeah, and I thought the same thing, like with the name. Although this is like an Indian gentleman, so he's treated almost like he's like this mystic man. That's right. Coming out that.
Yeah, that's supposed to be kind of like, what did he say? Like a ham radio for the paranormal, for the supernatural. So the idea is that he can kind of tune in with spirits, and he does the shtick that you've seen maybe countless times before. And I say shtick, being maybe a little bit of a skeptic, but the idea is that in the context of this movie, there is a little bit of like carnival kind of like presentation to this guy where he's guessing a name, and the idea is that someone in the audience should have a connection to that name. And the way that's kind of explored is to kind of set up the fact that maybe this guy could actually be authentic. Maybe he actually is a reader, a psychic, but also maybe he's not, and he's just kind of full of it.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. The movie does a great job of kind of disarming you with the opening act of the show, because he comes out and it would be very familiar to anyone that's ever seen like a skit on what a psychic or a medium is supposed to do, because he's doing I'm getting the letter P or the letter B, and then someone's like, B? Like, no, P. And then he's like, it's Peterson. And then, then it becomes like a running joke of how like people will, it's almost like the suggestive power where he's not really getting the name, but it's close enough where someone is like making that leap to be like, oh, do you mean Peterman? He's like, yes, it's someone in your family. He's like, my wife's maiden name is, and so it's played for laughs, but it starts to turn you at the end of his segment where he seems to connect with this woman and her daughter about her son that killed himself. And, he's pulling out some stuff that only the woman and her daughter would know. Like, he would have no way of knowing these things. And, and Jack is just kind of like, wow, that's great. And, of course, they have to cut to a commercial break as this ends. But like right before it ends, you get your first hint of something might not be right with this, with the show and the goings on here, where he has a bit of an incident, and his nose starts bleeding as they're going to commercial, and then we're off and running from there. But I did like that there's some very funny comedic moments throughout that kind of play on the tropes of the style of show that you're watching, but also just the timing of just as things are ramping up, Jack turns to the cameras like, we want to find out more, and we will after a word from our sponsors. Like there's a couple of those moments where he's like, even in that moment, he's still beholden to the people paying the bills for the show.
Coming up, it's television's spookiest night in a special Halloween edition of Night Owls with Jack Delroy. Tonight, medium and psychic Christu demonstrates how he speaks to the dead.
You hear these voices of the dead all the time. I guess the burning question is, how the hell do you get any sleep?
Hypnotist Carmichael Haig puts the audience and yours truly in a spine-chilling trance. Then parapsychologist June Ross Mitchell introduces us to Lily, the subject of her book, Conversations with the Devil. Don't miss the television event of the year, tonight on Night Owls with Jack Delroy.
Then we get to Carmichael the Conjurer, and he's that ex-magician that's the skeptic, and he's part of an organization that essentially debunks the supernatural to the point where he actually pulls out a check for $100,000 that, again, for 1970s money, that's pretty good money, and he's essentially carrying out this check for anyone that can debunk, that can show proof of the supernatural. And again, that's kind of an interesting character because he is this ex-magician. So in some ways, he can see behind that attempt to exploit the audience, to be sensationalist, to not actually have supernatural or paranormal abilities. And the way he plays it is interesting because compared to everyone else, especially David Dastmalchian, who's 1,000% engaged with his role, there's something about the way Carmichael, that actor, it feels slightly off in his performance.
Yeah, I was noting that his performance in many parts feels like he was like a stage actor, like you're watching a play, just in his line delivery. Yes. And just in the way that he would kind of come in right after a line, and it made sense because he was oftentimes addressing the studio audience. Yes. But it came across almost like you were watching a play, and he was kind of projecting to a live, like we were part of a play watching audience as well. So I was like, it was interesting. It didn't take me out of the movie at all, and it's not necessarily even a criticism. It was just more of an interesting observation at how he was delivering his lines.
I wonder if that performance was actually purposeful, because in some ways he was the villain of the movie. He literally was like the mustache twirling villain, and he's antagonizing Dr. June, essentially belittling her and her parapsychology. So I'm just wondering if that was a direction that came from the directors or maybe from the actor who just wanted to take that perspective.
I would think so, yeah, because he comes across as very self-satisfied, and it's very much like, you can't fool me. I was doing this before, and now I know all the tricks. So now, I'm telling you, I'm spilling the tea on how this is all done. It's kind of like the masked magician showing all like the magic tricks and how all the illusions are done. But I thought it was interesting how he was juxtaposed with how Jack Del Rey is. You're trying to like figure out, like, is he in on this stuff? Like, is he get that this is all kind of goofy and he's just doing it for ratings, or is he maybe kind of a believer? And there's a bit of a transformative part of that goes on as his show goes on. And one of the conceits of this movie that we were talking about after we watched it, that a friend of the podcast, Kat Moore, brought up that did not work for her, was in between, when they cut to commercial, because this is portrayed as a found or a lost show. Yes. That they found the footage of. So they're showing the broadcast of it. But when they cut to commercial, the camera then goes to black and white, and it's almost like fly on the wall behind the scenes of while they're in break and like getting prepped and they're getting their makeup redone and retouched and all that. You're privy to these conversations going on, and it's like, okay, would this camera really be picking up this stuff? And that took Kat out of her experience with the movie. I personally viewed it as it's not meant to be like a documentary style at that point. It's just kind of like filling in the blanks of what's going on while you're in commercial. And the black and white is used to kind of keep you in the 70s as opposed to reminding you that you're watching a film. And so it's cheating a little bit. But again, everything was working so well at this point that I'm like, yeah, go with it. Go for it. I want a little more information. So you're getting a little bit in drips and drabs in between in the commercial break. The spiral starts widening as things get a little bit more and more out of control as we go forward.
That's right. Yeah, those in-between commercial scenes have that sort of omnipresent camera that we've come to expect from The Office and Parks and Recreation, which, again, was a different choice than, say, we saw Chris LaMartina make in the WNUF Halloween special, where that found footage, the idea that you almost found that VHS at a thrift store or a flea market, you pop it in, and now you're seeing this broadcast as someone recorded it with the commercials intact, in place. So you're watching the broadcast. You could fast forward through some of the commercials, but that's part of the experience of WNUF, that you're watching these commercials that are very authentic to small businesses in the area. And again, some of the creative, low-budget commercials that they release, and also some of the news broadcast that goes along with it. So again, you're just watching this thing that was recorded versus Late Night with the Devil, where you're getting that peek behind the scenes, something that, unless you're watching something that's scripted, that's not found footage, you would not have access to. Just a different approach.
But you get to meet like these other crew members, and the one guy has like the classic line, who's seen my sacrificial dagger?
I love that.
Just as he's just like passing by the camera, like you get like little moments like that. You get extra little bits of character development, because at one point the sidekick, who's been trying to really talk to Jack the whole time, at one point during one of the breaks is like, Jack, I need to talk to you. He's like, can't it wait? There's a lot. He's like, no, it cannot. And this is when things are starting to get a little bit hairy. And this guy is obviously a bit more of a devout believer than Jack may or may not be. And so he's like, what you're doing, this is sorcery. And, he's getting a little bit nervous. He's like, the crew's freaking out. People are leaving. But you get a little bit more of that dynamic rather than just what you see on camera of like the banter back and forth. And so you get to see a little bit more into how these, actual people out when the cameras aren't rolling, what their, interpersonal dynamics actually are.
And all of it is really building up to that the third segment where Dr. June comes in with Liddy. And that's where we start really getting into why this is Late Night with the Devil, and certainly leaning into a lot of The Exorcist, because Liddy, the young girl, and she seems to be somewhere in like the maybe 10 to, 12, 13, 14-year-old age, and she has a lot of that Regan-ness from The Exorcist, played masterfully by Linda Blair. There's a sense of innocence, that kind of quirkiness where she's like, oh, what camera should I be looking at? She's certainly not comfortable being on stage. And Dr. June, who seems to be a pretty straightforward scientist, although she's studying in the world of parapsychology, but nevertheless seems to be earnest, seems to be honest in what she's doing. But then you get those little bits of layering to where Liddy makes like a comment, Jack, Dr. June thinks you're handsome, not just handsome, but very handsome. So there's like these little connections that are being made to just keep layering the fact that maybe something else is happening, that Liddy may have information she shouldn't have, and how does she have it? Again, just kind of going into the whole exorcist demon kind of vibe.
Yeah, and I love the young woman that plays Letty does a fantastic job of like really unnerving the audience, and I mean both audiences, like the in-movie audience and the audience in the theater, because she's coming out of a horrible trauma. She's working through that trauma with her doctor. Right off the bat, like this isn't a good idea. She probably should not be on a television show. Just from the fact that she doesn't have the social skills. She's like staring in the camera, and she's got like a kind of a creepy smile on her face. So right off the bat, you're like, something's off with this young woman. And she plays it so well. And she starts dropping some things again where she might be privy to some knowledge that maybe she shouldn't be, but maybe she is, or maybe she just overhears some things. And Jack pushes things into, do you think we could speak with the entity inside Libby, who she refers to as Mr. Wriggles, kind of a nod to Captain Howdy, I think a little bit of Exorcist fame.
Absolutely.
Because as she says, he wriggles inside my head and then he wriggles back out. which is kind of a really unnerving thing to think about.
Yes. So at one point they mentioned, and I wanted to ask you, Pete, because they mentioned they call Jack Del Roy Mr. Midnight, and I'm wondering if this show probably aired from midnight to 1 or 11 to midnight. Feels more likely it was like 11 to midnight, right?
It's a good question because they do plan to throw it to Cleo, whoever Cleo is after. So there's an even later show after that. So good question. I would guess he was probably like the 11 to midnight, and then, Cleo comes on after Mr. Midnight, and I would assume that she's got the 12 to 1 slot.
And I only bring it up, I guess, more as a testament to the film, like celebrating all the stuff it really does well, because it's such a great concept in that you're watching this live broadcast, and, live can be dangerous. Like, anything can happen. So while you're also balancing the fact that this could be a gimmick, that this whole thing could be manufactured, Jack is certainly pining for views, for ratings, and this is certainly a way that he can try to do that. Or on the other side, that you're actually watching something paranormal happen on this TV show, on this show, and that the shock of it is, it's real. And I think that's the part, is that the high concept of it all is still really simply and authentically well done.
And I think, to your point, Bernie, and I think what really hits the sweet spot for the attention to detail that they have in this, it's not just the set decoration, which is impeccable, and it's not just the costuming. It's like the little things of something as minute as like when they're coming back from one of the breaks and Jack is sitting in the wrong seat and they're about to go live and he's getting counted down and he's like, oops, wrong seat. And then he has to like quickly shuffle. It's like those little things that go on behind the scenes that it just adds that little extra air of authenticity to it, that you're actually watching something that did air at one point in the 70s. It's those attentions to detail that I think are going to win this movie a lot of goodwill amongst the audience and is going to turn this, you never can predict what's going to be a cult favorite or what's not, but I think this one has a great shot of becoming one of those cult films for little things like that on top of everything else.
I think if you grew up in an era where you watch Carson, you watch late night TV, if you're a fan of found footage, I think if you're really into kind of a really immersive experience with a lot of authenticity, this movie gives you a lot to love.
Right. And, and everyone's opinions and mileage will vary on this. So I did see that the AV Club gave this an A and thought that the whole movie was a masterpiece. And, kudos for that. Like Bernie said, like like I said earlier, I was just where I thought this movie was going was in a slightly different direction than it ends up. And I guess we could go into, the ending of the movie at this point. Things kind of build and you learn some things about Jack during the course of the show. Not just that he is kind of hell-bent on becoming number one and will, cut corners and do some things that might put his guests at risk to get there. There's some information revealed about his ex-wife, well, not ex-wife, his wife is deceased. It's hinted at early on, and he kind of starts to reveal some information when, is it Cal?
Yeah, Carmichael, the magician.
Was talking about the first guest and how he was, full of shit. And he's like, well, he mentioned a name Millie. He's like, that was my wife's nickname or something like that. And he reveals that information. It's revealed that his wife died of cancer at one point. That might lend some credence to maybe this wasn't made up, but...
Yeah, the reading was meant for him. It was meant for Jack.
Right. The reading was meant for him. You don't know it at the time, and they kind of go to commercial before that is resolved, and he reveals that in, while they're on break. And then you get to the final segment with Libby and June, and Libby starts tossing out information. There's a moment where she's kind of speaking, she is speaking in his dead wife's voice that kind of catches him for a second. He's not sure if that's what he heard or not. And then she starts to reveal some information of like, we've met before. This is when June does brings out Mr. Wriggles for the audience, even though she has serious reservations about it. Again, you could kind of speak to what is she thinking that she goes forward with this.
And the reservations she has about essentially, exploiting Liddy, but, also at the same time, because she's a believer in the fact that Liddy, her ward, this lone survivor from the satanic cult, is possessed. So if she's going to be exploited on TV, she wants to have these restraints, like literal restraints, put on this young girl to make sure that if the demon were to show himself, that nothing could happen, that it could have some sort of control, all because Dr. June is just continuously assaulted by Carr, and his debunking and his, just going after her over and over again to debunk everything she's about, questioning her parapsychology, her science, and Liddy, to the point where Carr actually ups the ante, and that check for $100,000 to debunk, to prove the existence of the paranormal goes up to $500,000.
Yeah, we don't want to spoon feed this whole movie to you, so, without going into every granular detail.
And I'll just say, let's just get into the ending. And again, if you haven't seen it, certainly all the spoiler alerts right now, because this is the part that Pete and I really wanted to discuss, again, because we loved so much of this movie that we do kind of want to give a little time to the thing that didn't work. So set up the ending, Pete.
Shit goes down. The demon kind of takes control of the studio, but then it kind of switches, and this is where it kind of lost Bernie and I a little bit, where the conceit gets dropped, and it's kind of about Jack. You think that he's kind of stuck in like some kind of time loop where he's like hosting the show in like an alternate reality, very dreamlike. The satanic cult comes back, and it really comes around to Jack's made a deal with the devil to become number one, and what he had to sacrifice was his wife's life. He finally comes to after this is all revealed, and he has not stabbed his wife as he thinks he has. He stabbed Libby with the sacrificial dagger, and he's in a now empty studio with him being the only surviving member as the police sirens are coming.
And that's where, like, towards this end, maybe like the last 10 or so minutes, everything about the movie changes. You start seeing more Dutch angles. Everything feels very off-center, whereas before you kind of have those very staged, set up camera sight lines, the things that we are all kind of seeing, you kind of get used to watching on a late night talk show type set, and all of that is gone. Everything feels very kinetic, very weird. You get a little bit of that vertigo effect because that's what Jack is feeling. Everything is very disoriented, and that part worked for me. That was fine, but there was certainly a sense that they were kind of searching, kind of like, scratching towards something and ending a theme that, again, for both of us made a lot of sense because it wasn't very subtle. The whole idea of selling your soul to the devil, making a deal with the devil, that was pretty much in the foreground. It just felt like all the subtlety that they had set up for, the 90% of the movie, the 95% of the movie was kind of lost for this more bombastic type of ending.
Yeah, and I think I may be wrong. My take and my sense was that the filmmakers were going for one of those gonzo 70s satanic panic type endings. And I get it. I was kind of geared up with the way that everything else went for maybe a little more of an abrupt ending and something that was going to be a little more ambiguous or leave you hanging a little bit more. It's a low budget film, so some of the effects at the end are a little bit hokey.
And I think we both walked away accepting the fact that the effects could be hokey, but they shouldn't take us out of the movie, a movie that had earned so much goodwill by being authentic, by having a certain level of subtlety that we very much appreciated. That's really what makes this high concept sing, and the execution of it works so well. And then at the end, to just get hit by that sledgehammer, to get hit by effects that feel a little bit off, that's what took us a little bit out.
Yeah, and I think really the ending's not really needed because, like, to your point about the sledgehammer, the rest of the movie does such a good job of, like, we understand, we don't get the I made a deal with the devil part of it, but we understand why he's making his decisions. it's subtle enough, but we all get what's going on here. And we get that, yes, this is a commentary on what are you willing to do to reach a certain echelon and watch how it all comes tumbling down. We get all of those beats. And so to kind of throw in that ending part, it gives you a reason and it gives you more of an explanation. But I would argue that it's not needed because of everything that is presented throughout it. Like you see Jack kind of like rolling through everything that's going on. You can see him in his eyes, the calculations he's making of like, I don't know, I just had a guest die on the way to the hospital. Should we maybe just shut this down? But the producers in his ear, like, people are going crazy. We've done it. You did it. Like the producers, they want this. They want more. Now it's like, do you lose all control of like the will or the self-control to like rein in something that can be really harmful, not just for you and for your career, but like physically harmful to the people on the show. And, yet he makes those choices and can't do it, can't rein it back even when he's faced with, all the stuff that's going on and endangering a young girl's life. We see it all unfold. He's now at the mercy of whatever it takes to drive this, further. We need more. Whatever you've seen up until now, it's still not enough. I need more. And it's like, we get everything that is implying, but a slight disappointment to an otherwise great movie-going experience and something that I'll definitely be looking forward to revisiting again, regardless of how I feel about the ending.
100% agree. And I love just like the entry point to this in that David Dastmalchian and just the way he plays Jack is, it's a guide. And I think that's something about late night talk show hosts. Their audience are people who've had a long day of work, the night owls, just like the name of this show, right? It's appealing to them. People who maybe just want to fall asleep. And through this late night talk show host, they're kind of like guided along to the end of their day. And yes, in this guy's case, he doesn't have A-list celebrities, A-list musicians, but nevertheless, he's trying to make the best out of it. He's trying to provide a certain level of entertainment. There's something so interesting about that, especially when in Late Night with the Devil, things go terribly, terribly wrong, and he's still trying to follow the conventions of, like you'd mentioned, cutting to commercial and trying to keep his cool, foregoing the whole like agreement with a late night show where it's kind of innocuous entertainment. Yes, it could be entertainment, but it's not going to devolve into a nightmare, which this certainly does. And ultimately, the buildup of this movie is what's amazing. The payoff, debatable, but again, that was really just for us. If I was asked at any point if I would recommend this, I would happily do it. Because again, even though the ending didn't land for me, didn't land for us, it's still pretty remarkable. The performances, just the overall movie, it's definitely worth a watch. Highly recommended.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'll just leave with, I'd like to think that the Joe Franklin of my youth would have stepped in before things got too hairy and we're like, sorry, folks, it's getting a little too much. And so
for everybody, a great big thank you. As we say, I'll be seeing you very, very soon. And thanks for the memory. And the best is yet to come. I mean that.
All the best.